In the ice, they found a body older than the pyramids, with a weapon still lodged inside it, and blood from 4 other people who were never identified. September 19th, 1991. 2 hikers are crossing the Ötzi Alps when Erika Simon sees something brown poking out of the melting ice. Her first thought, someone dumped a broken doll up here. Then they get closer. It's a head, shoulders, skin gone leathery and dark, stretched over bone. Rescue teams treat it like any other recovery. A climber, dead maybe a few decades. They're wrong by about 5,000 years. And before anyone realizes that, one expensive mistake nearly destroys him for good. Stick around because figuring out who those 4 people were and what actually happened on that mountain is one of the strangest investigations in archaeology. If mysteries like this are your thing, subscribe. And if you've got a theory before I get there, drop it in the comments. The recovery of Ötzi's body might be one of the worst-handled excavations in the history of archaeology. And that's exactly why the story is so remarkable. Rescuers spent the first day trying to chip him free with ski poles and ice axes, not realizing one of the sticks jammed in beside the body was actually his own bow. Bad weather shut the operation down entirely, twice. When they finally got him out, a police officer using a pneumatic drill accidentally punched a hole straight through the body's hip. At one point, curious onlookers were taking photos posed next to the corpse like a tourist attraction. Nobody treated this like an archaeological find because nobody yet understood what it was. Then there was the jurisdiction problem. The body was found essentially on top of the Austrian-Italian border, so both countries' authorities got involved before anyone had confirmed which side he'd technically been found on. A survey days later settled it. The body sat just 92.56 meters inside Italy. A 5,000-year-old man, and his first fight after death was a border dispute. For a mummy, this old to survive at all is close to a geological accident. Most bodies exposed on a moving glacier get ground apart within years or scavenged within days. Ötzi's body, though, had settled into a narrow, sheltered rock gully, protected from the crushing weight of the ice sheet above it. Snow and meltwater sealed him in what was essentially a natural freezer, undisturbed for over 5,000 years. That freak of geography is the only reason we know anything about how he died, because for the first decade after his discovery, nobody did. Early theories ranged from simple exposure, caught in a storm, frozen to death, to something stranger, that he was a chieftain, deliberately given up to the mountain as a ritual sacrifice. One theory floated years later even proposed he wasn't a traveler at all, but a body deliberately carried up and left at that altitude as part of a funeral rite, his gear serving as burial offerings rather than survival equipment. The truth, once scientists finally found it, was more violent than any of these theories, and far more specific. In 2001, 10 years after Ötzi came out of the ice, researchers took another look at his body using more advanced imaging. And there, wedged between his ribcage and left shoulder blade, was something every previous scan had somehow missed. A small flint arrowhead, barely the length of a thumbnail. The wooden shaft had snapped off, likely by whoever fired it, which is probably exactly why it went undetected for a decade. No shaft sticking out, no obvious sign this was a weapon wound. A more advanced CT scan confirmed the real damage. The arrow had torn straight through his subclavian artery, a major vessel running just beneath the collarbone. Even with a modern trauma team on hand, this injury carries a serious risk of death. Ötzi had no trauma team, no medicine, and no help. Researchers later pinned down the timeline using a detail almost nobody would think to check. Fibrin, a clotting protein that shows up at a wound within minutes but breaks down within hours. Its presence told scientists Ötzi didn't linger for days after being shot, overturning an earlier theory that he'd survived the injury for some time. He bled out fast, likely within minutes. Cause of death solved. Murder weapon identified. If this were an open and shut case, that's where it would end. It isn't. Around the same time, researchers noticed something else entirely. A deep, already healing cut across Ötzi's right hand, wedged between his thumb and index finger. Forensic analysts recognized the shape and depth of the wound immediately. It's a textbook defensive injury, the kind of cut that happens when someone instinctively throws a hand up to block a close-range slash from a bladed weapon. It's a wound investigators still see in knife fight cases today. The critical detail was the healing. The tissue around the cut showed it wasn't fresh. It had already started to close by the time Ötzi died. That put it days before the fatal arrow strike, not in the same incident. This wasn't one ambush. Ötzi appears to have survived a violent close-quarters confrontation, kept moving through brutal alpine terrain for at least a couple of days afterward, wounded hand and all, and then walked straight into a second fatal encounter high in the mountains. German archaeologist Egerter Vogel went further, arguing the wound placement on Ötzi's back was no accident. It's the exact spot prehistoric hunters were trained to aim for to drop large game in a single shot, suggesting his killer knew precisely what they were doing. Vogel's theory adds one more chilling detail. He believes whoever fired the arrow also removed the shaft afterward and never touched Ötzi's copper axe or his other valuables, deliberately so as not to be tied to the body later. This is where the case stops looking like a hunting accident and starts looking like a real crime scene investigation frozen in ice for 50 centuries. In 2003, a research team led by Dr. Tom Loy at the University of Queensland used advanced blood residue analysis on Ötzi's gear, his knife, his cloak, and one of his own unfinished arrows. The results were extraordinary. DNA evidence from 4 separate people who weren't Ötzi. 2 entirely distinct blood profiles were recovered from a single arrow alone. Read that again. 1 arrow from his own quiver, carrying the blood of 2 different people, neither of them him. That is not consistent with one clean ambush. Researchers still debate what it means. One theory: Ötzi fought off multiple attackers in that earlier confrontation and wounded at least 2 of them himself, explaining the blood on his own weapon. Another: he was helping carry or treat companions injured in a separate fight entirely, and the blood transferred onto his gear that way. What isn't in dispute is this: in his final days alive, Ötzi came into violent, bloody contact with at least 4 different human beings, and every single one of them remains completely unidentified over 5,000 years later. And when he was finally found, frozen mid-collapse, he was still gripping his knife. While all of this forensic work was unfolding, Ötzi's body was giving up secrets that had nothing to do with how he died. His stomach and intestines still held the remains of his last 2 meals. The final one, red deer meat and einkorn wheat. The meal before that, ibex meat alongside other plants. Pollen preserved in his gut even let researchers pin down the season of his death. Early spring, not the late summer or autumn everyone originally assumed. Meaning the snow-free gully theory investigators started with was wrong from day one. His skin carried over 60 tattoos, not decoration, but simple lines and dots, clustered almost entirely around his joints, knees, ankles, wrists, lower back. Cross-referenced against his skeleton, those exact joints showed early arthritis and degeneration. The leading theory: these weren't tattoos as we think of them today, but an early form of pain treatment, a precursor to acupuncture, marking precisely where his body hurt. His DNA held more: the oldest confirmed case of Lyme disease in history, a genetic predisposition to hardened arteries, despite what must have been an intensely physical lifestyle and an inherited intolerance to dairy, in a population only just beginning to farm milk-producing animals. And his equipment told its own story of status: a copper axe, extraordinarily rare and valuable metal for his era, the kind of object that marked him as someone with real standing, not just another traveler crossing the mountains. So here's what more than 3 decades of forensic science has actually reconstructed. A man in his mid-40s, reasonably wealthy and well-equipped for his time, survived one violent, bloody encounter, kept moving through brutal alpine terrain for days afterward with a wounded hand, and was finally brought down from behind, shot by someone who knew exactly where to aim, bleeding out within minutes, alone at over 10,000 feet in early spring, still clutching his knife. What we still don't know, after everything: who fired that arrow, why, and who the 4 other people were, whose blood ended up on a dead man's belongings and then froze there for 5,000 years, waiting for someone to finally look close enough to notice. It might be the most thoroughly investigated death in all of human history. It is also, to this day, still technically unsolved.